Hey everybody. Today I'm talking about roads and how do we get places and why do roads go where they go. And this is going to be kind of a little bit of, on one hand it's a travel log, we're going to look at some maps. Well, the question is, how did we get roads across the country? Why do they go where they go? And I have a specific one in mind. And that is, as this country grew up, we had, growth on the coast, primarily the East Coast, and then people were trying to get to the West Coast. They were settling in between. But we had settlements in California, and we had settlements on the East Coast, and people were trying to travel back and forth in between. And that travel was difficult. And it was many, many years before we had, people started with horse and buggy, stagecoach, walking. There were lots of things. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is, those of you that know, I have reason to travel out to Wyoming. And recently, I made the driving trip from Michigan all the way out to Wyoming. And there are two things. One is, as having been an automotive engineer in the powertrain world, I'm always interested in the challenges of going across different kinds of terrain, altitude, grade, curves, all of those kinds of things. One, from a powertrain engine transmission performance point of view, and then from a fuel economy and efficiency point of view. And in these ages where, in the age where I was working on hybrids and electrics, it gets even more and more critical because you're really trying to refine the energy usage, and grade, where the road goes is a big deal. I'll just say is if this is an old highway map from back at near the turn of the century, like I think 1918. This is a very old map, but it's useful for this. This is old highways. I live in southeast Michigan today, and there's the glaciers 12,000 years ago. The glaciers came down across Michigan and the northern U.S. and they were like a mile thick. And in southeast Michigan is one of the places where they terminated. They ended, and so the gravel and sand and stuff that they ground down from the northern parts of the Lower Peninsula, a lot of it ended up and washed out in the southern part. So there's a ridge, based off of the glaciers that goes like from Port Huron down across southeast Michigan and down into northern Indiana, down around Angola area. And, it's a set of hills. And I used to work at General Motors Proving Grounds. My office was on the top of the hill at 1,200 feet overlooking, the valleys I'll call to the north. But 1,200 feet was about as high as you get in southern Michigan. There's a few spots further to the north where they exceed that a little. Our reference is the Great Lakes, right? And the Great Lakes, so the elevations that you're working from in the Great Lakes are the Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Saginaw Bay is around 575 feet. Lake St. Clair is a little bit lower, but I think you're around 560 or so. So as you travel around Michigan, you start at, if you started in Detroit, you're down around 560, 570 feet. You go over those ridges, which most of them aren't 1,200 feet, and then you move on out. It's a fairly low elevation, and there's some hills to go around. The major challenge for a road is getting around all of the lakes that the glaciers left behind, and many of the roads are based on where the paths were a couple of centuries ago, as people worked their way around the lakes. But when it came to fuel economy, I could tell because we were measuring closely. If I was at my office at 1,200 feet and I was going to Warren, which is about at 600 feet plus a little bit, the fuel economy going down to Warren was much better than the fuel economy going back uphill to my office, going the opposite direction. For example, most of us out in the Great Lakes area don't have great challenges. Now, as I go forward here, I'm going to show you, this is going to be kind of a travel log. I mean, I'm going to show you dash cam footage. I'm going to show you how you go across the country from Michigan to Wyoming. That's my goal right now. This is a map from back in the 1950s when they were laying out the interstate system. Now, some of these numbers have changed, but the routes are similar. And so right now it's I-94 down here through Kalamazoo, and when you get down here to Indiana, back at Lake Michigan level at 575 or Chicago, you go on across to Moline, Davenport on 80, and you go across Iowa to Council Bluffs, and then you go across Nebraska a long ways out here to Cheyenne. But kind of the question is, why do you do that? Why does it look like that? So I'll just say is that, here in Michigan, we have, the interstates are fairly flat. They got a little bit of roll to them. We have some nice trees and some pretty country as we're heading out toward Chicago. And I'll tell you as I go through this, you're going to see some, I took dash cam footage going out and I took dash cam footage coming back. And so sometimes you're going to see them intermixed, but the way this is going to flow is from Michigan out to Wyoming. And we'll talk about the challenges and things as we go. It's a 1,200-mile trip from Michigan to Wyoming, and it's 18 hours of driving if you don't stop. And boy, just think about in covered wagon days, how many weeks and months would it have taken you to go 1,200 miles? There weren't roads, Now here, we moved over into Illinois, and this is one of the major landmarks. It's the river, I believe Illinois River, coming out of Chicago. As you're heading out across the state of Illinois. And Illinois, again, is another one of those states that is, it's relatively flat. I mean, there's a little bit of rolling, there are some hills, but there aren't any great challenges in grades or anything from a road standpoint. You get on these interstates and you just kind of cruise. There's a lot of pretty country out there. But if you go back 150 years, people made trails across, and it wasn't so difficult. Now, when you get down here to Iowa, you're coming across the Mississippi River. And when you cross the Mississippi, that elevation's, again, it's about 575 or so. It's almost like back at the level of the Great Lakes, as the water's draining down from Minnesota and heading out. And so you go across Iowa, and it's probably more rolling than Illinois is. It's not flat. It's kind of interesting because they do some terracing in their farms. You see in this picture, you can kind of see the terraces where they do have some breaks on the hillsides. And it's some pretty country as you're coming across. When you get in the middle of here and you go through Des Moines' a pretty big city, and so you get a much wider interstate and you have to slow down, and then you'll get back out in the countryside again. When you get across Iowa, then you get to the Missouri River, which is a little more elevation. You've picked up a few hundred feet across the whole state. You get to 965 feet at Omaha. And as you come across to Omaha, it's a little bit rolling also, and then it starts to flatten out as you head down toward Lincoln. This is a map from the Library of Congress of the survey that was put in for the Transcontinental Railroad. Now think for a minute, go back and think about how did settlers make it across the country, right? This map starts over at the right-hand side in Omaha, and it goes across Nebraska, Wyoming, and Utah, and into Nevada. This is the Union Pacific map, and then there was a Central Pacific came out of California and went to hook up with them. I'm not going to go over that far. I'm kind of looking at the middle part a lot. So as you got across to Iowa, you're still only at about 900 feet. You could do that in Michigan. A lot of different places. But then this is where things get challenging, and so back up again. How did people get where they were going to go? In the early days, well, Native Americans were here and they had their routes. Early settlers came across and did, again, came by covered wagon or by horse or whatever. And most of the time, people want to follow river valleys. They want to follow rivers because the rivers, you may have a big waterfall like Niagara Falls, but most places the rivers run on a relatively gradual slope that people can accommodate, so they tend to follow the rivers. One, they follow the rivers because it's easier. Two, they follow the rivers because they need water for their horses, or later on for steam trains, or whichever. And so as you go across, I'm going to pull in here, as you go across Nebraska from Omaha over here, the old road and the railroad, well, first, before the railroad, you had the Oregon Trail. And the Oregon Trail tracked across, followed the river, and I think there were several different routes, but the main way, if you had kids who, 20 years ago or whatever were playing computer games, 20, 30 years ago, there was one called Oregon Trail. My kids loved to play on the early things on the computer. It would come out along the Platte River, it would go up along the North Platte, head into Wyoming and pick up the Sweetwater River, and head across to South Pass, and people are trying to get to Oregon. And that works pretty good, but if you look at the map, this is the survey map closely, it's a long way around, because when you come out here, this is where the North Platte and the South Platte come together out here. The North Platte comes up, and it's a long ways kind of out of the way if you want to go straight across. So the railroad tried to go more direct. The highways, when cars came around, tried to do the same thing. US 30 and the Lincoln Highway tended to do that as well. And then Interstate 80 came along and did that only better. When the interstate highways came along, you had better equipment, right? You could move dirt. You could cut and fill and cut and fill, and cars were stronger. They could take steeper grades. I think on the interstate system, there may be some places where you can still get to an 8% grade, but most of them were, I think they tend to try to limit you to about 5%. And the railroads, of course, need less than that. So when you start over here at Omaha, you're under 1,000 feet. When you get across to North Platte's about 2,000 feet. So you've gone up another 1,000 feet going halfway across the state. By the time you get to Cheyenne, it's at 6,000 feet. Everybody talks about the mile-high city being Denver, because it is, 5,200. But Cheyenne's almost another 1,000 feet above Denver. And then you have to get across these mountains over to Laramie, and the peak of I80 is at 8,600 feet. So let's go back here and we'll look at a little bit of video as we go across. So out here we're running across Nebraska, and it seems fairly flat. It's a gradual grade, and as you get further and further west and further up, it tends to get more arid. In this stretch there are a lot of trees, but you're running very close to the south, or you're running very close to the Platte River, and there's moisture, and so the vegetation and the trees seem to grow pretty well. But you just keep on climbing. And here we cross a piece of the Platte River. There's several places here where I80 crosses a branch or a feed to the Platte River. Here's another one. And one of the things that's interesting about the North Platte River is that, as I showed you a minute ago, it swings up to the north and makes a loop around the mountains, and it actually comes out of Colorado. I learned that by accident. We were on the west side of the Rockies coming out of Rocky Mountain National Park, and as we wanted to go up into Wyoming, it was a real easy run because it follows the very upper reaches of the North Platte River out into Wyoming, which then flows all the way up north, I think, to Casper, and then makes a loop around. But it's a long way around if you want to drive across country. Now here, we're making the break where the South Platte River is heading off from us and heading toward Denver, where it comes more from the Denver direction. And then there's a spot here that we stopped at Julesburg, and took some pictures. It was kind of an interesting junction of where people came in. Ah, yes, and here's my Toyota. I'm a GM guy, but we didn't want to drive a big vehicle all the way across country, 3,000 miles. And so I rented a car that I could put my tools and equipment in. And we ended up with a Toyota Camry, and I have to say it was a nice car. And, you know, for the whole trip we got like 42 miles on a gallon, running at 75 miles an hour and even more in places. The interesting thing though is, as you're heading here, now you can see where I'm at, we're running more and more and more up the grades. And this is where you're really starting to, you're working the car pretty hard. It's getting arid, there's very little moisture around. The rivers have left. There are some creeks around, but you're running separate from that for the most part. But this stretch going from that junction up into Wyoming, I was getting more like 30-35 miles per gallon going, and I got like 46-47 coming back down on my way home. You know, a couple of percent grade. It's not huge, but it's a couple of percent grade sustained over hundreds of miles. Not continuous, you know, it kind of goes up and down. Oh, and here is the home of Cabela's at Sydney. And at Sydney, we're still going uphill. It's just miles and miles of open country out here. I had a neighbor tell me that on this stretch of road, he was out there several years ago when he came upon somebody with a Tesla towing a camper that was trying to make it up these long grades, and he was on the shoulder with his flashers on, and he was kind of going at he said almost an idle, because, I mean, electric cars don't idle, but going very, very slow, preserving charge, because you go out here, you're miles and miles from any place you can charge an electric car. And here we've reached Wyoming at Pine Bluff, which you can kind of see off here to the side is off to the left in this picture. You can see it's a bluff. It's a ridge with trees on it, which is kind of different. Then we get out on the flat here heading into Cheyenne, and we're still climbing, right? At the state line at Pine Bluff, it's only about 5,100 feet. In this stretch, you can see that the railroad's running off to our right-hand side. We're running parallel to it. As we come into Cheyenne here, we kind of come over a little bit of a ridge. You can see the city down below a little bit. It's kind of in a valley also. It's not a big river valley, but it's a valley. Crow Creek is the main one that runs through there. It goes past the rail yard and heads down, but it doesn't flow down to Nebraska. It makes a turn and flows down to the South Platte in Colorado. And here we're coming in here. This is the entrance to Cheyenne from the west, right where the rail yard begins. You can see off to the right, there's one of the trains pulling out as I'm coming into town. So to talk about the ridge, this is looking south on the south side of Cheyenne. It's kind of interesting to me also, where does the state line start and end? Why did they decide to make certain things break where they did? Maybe just coincidence, but on the south side of Cheyenne, it's at 6,000 feet, but you've got a ridge to the south of town, just about at the state line, that's running maybe 6,200 or 6,300 feet before you go into Colorado and drop off. And then to the north side, you have another ridge. It's another couple of hundred feet. It's another 6,200, 6,300 feet. And you can see the water towers for the city are up there. And here I'm up by the ridge with the water towers and looking south. And so you can kind of see how the city sits down. And then you can see off to the west the next mountain range between Cheyenne and Laramie, which is the next challenge. This morning I'm making a run out. I'm kind of curious, as you come out of Cheyenne, there's a climb up to Laramie. As you go to Laramie, there's a climb to pretty high elevation. Don't have it in front of me, but it's like 8,200 or 8,300 feet on Interstate 80. And I just thought I'd take a run out. What you'll notice off to the left is oncoming train. Basically, the railroad and the interstate highway track along with each other. And this place where I'm headed will be the summit. It's the highest point on Interstate 80. Just to my left, where that train's coming in, this is basically the start of Union Pacific rail yard. And I've watched some really long trains coming in and out of here. So in any case, I'm going to head out here on this is US 30, the Lincoln Highway. And if I understand it correctly, it'll hook into I80 for a run out here. It's sunrise. We're expecting rain and actually snow. It'll be the first snow of the season. So I'm going to try to go make this run. I'm just curious. It's not the best day probably for sightseeing because the weather's supposed to get nasty. But we're going to go make a run here and see how it goes. Warning sign. That's why I'm traveling this morning. So this stretch of road from Cheyenne heading to Laramie, the peak is in between Cheyenne and Laramie, but this is a lot steeper climb than coming out of Nebraska and into Wyoming. It's probably probably twice or more of the grade. So we got a bunch of climb to go. We got to do like 2,000 feet over 20 or 30 miles. Here we're crossing over the rail line. You can see off to the right there's a freight coming this way. The road, US 30, Lincoln Highway, and the railroads all kind of run parallel paths out here. Usually, when you get to I80, the interstate highway system, cars were better, equipment was better, and so the road can take steeper grades and make different cuts that the railroads and the horse and buggies and the stagecoaches couldn't do back in the day. See, that guy's got what? He's got 3 locomotives. There's a point of interest here, so I'm going to stop and see what the point of interest is. A little unusual for it to be in the middle, but let's stop and take a look here. So this is tree in a rock, and I think it's actually a tree surrounded by boulders. But it's been growing that way for hundreds of years, and it's an interesting landmark because the original Transcontinental Railroad, when it came out here, they were coming through this route, and the folks who were building it decided to move the railroad so that it didn't disturb that tree, and it's still growing here, a couple hundred years later. Well, from 1860, so not quite 200 years, but it's still going, and it's a, historical marker point. A few minutes ago, I was getting the start of rain. I was getting sprinkles on the windshield. Temperature's 38 degrees. One of the reasons I wanted to make this run is, again, because the storm's moving in, and right now you could hear in the background, I think I was getting sleet, very fine ice. It was peppering off the windshield, but nothing was sticking. Well, here comes that rest area, so let's see what she looks like. See how they can make cuts through places like this so much easier today with modern equipment, build the roads. Well, see, I was wrong. It's more than 82, so we're all the way to 8,640 feet. Highest point on Interstate 80. Just got a few pictures here of the paths that I80 cuts. And there's the Lincoln Monument, which, the Lincoln Highway was really the first transcontinental highway, and it followed very closely the route that the railroad took for the Transcontinental Railroad. That followed, other people's paths in history. And when I lived in South Bend, Indiana years ago, the Lincoln Highway comes through South Bend. So this is the visitor center at the top of at the peak of I-80. You can see from the route that the green line is the older road, and I-80 bypassed some of it. And in some places they run together even today. So they've still got a piece of the old US 30 highway in here, and it looks like it's several miles. I'm going to take it just for the fun of it. The camera really can't show the grade, but we're doing a lot of climbing, and this must take us up to the I'll say to the old summit before I-80 cut through. So in here we're in a spot where 30 is the old preserved road is paralleling I-80. I think we're going to end up connecting back up in a short while. called Monument Road. There's a road to something they call the Ames Monument. I don't know what that is, but I guess I'm going to go take a look. I'm guessing this is the Ames Monument. We'll take a look here and see what we got. Now, the significance of the Ames Monument, when I first went out there, I didn't know what it was. I had to go look it up. But the Ames, per the inscription, it was Oakes, Ames, and Oliver Ames, and they were deeply involved in creating the Transcontinental Railroad. And this monument is actually supposed to be at the high point of the original Transcontinental Railroad, at 8,247 feet elevation. And in subsequent years after that, there's been some relocation, and today the railroad max is at 8,015 at Sherman. And then once you get across the mountains, Laramie is still 7,200. But, you know, Wyoming, if you don't really realize it, Wyoming is like a high elevation desert. It's very dry, very arid most places. They get some moisture, but you know, most of the states seems to be above 6,000 feet, and it's very arid. Those of you from the Midwest or from the coast, you know, we're used to getting 60-70% humidity. When I was out there this summer, and it's 90 degrees and the humidity's 10, 12, 15% at the most. When I go back home and the humidity's 50, 60, 70, 80%, and if I'm lucky, I can get my house down to 30% with air conditioning in the humid summer. It's very significant. And from the Ames Monument, you can see the mountains. I decided to take this county road and do a little exploring, and by golly, I guess I'm exploring. But it is an official county road. It's called Monument Road, and I'm just curious where it ends up. It looks like on the map that it ends up back at I80 after a bit, so that it kind of makes a somewhat of a loop. So I've made it down Monument Road far enough that now I've encountered the rail line. So this is down, the rail takes a lower altitude, longer, more circuitous route around some of those higher elevations. So when you get to the bottom and you get to Dale Creek, where this railroad crossing is, that elevation is still 7,900 feet, but it's 350 feet lower than the Ames Monument. Well, that's far enough off the beaten path for right now. I'm going to go back to the main road, and we'll go from there. Well, we're coming down out of the mountains back toward Cheyenne, and you can kind of see how it flattens out of this mountain range out into the plains. I think I'm going to get back off of 80 and take 225. 225 is the road that came out of Cheyenne when I switched to get on to 80 and 30. And so this is the older. It looks like this is an older road, and it parallels the rail line here as we're heading back into Cheyenne. And we're heading now back into the city of Cheyenne, and say this old road 225 following the tracks, and just about as soon as you get under I-25 up there, then you start to get into that Union Pacific rail yard, and there's the tail end of one that's heading into the yard. There's one of those big dudes with 3 locomotives coming into the yard. So if I go back to my map here for a minute, so there's the Union Pacific Railroad, and one of the things you may not have seen is they did 2 things. This is the official survey map when they were laying out the Transcontinental Railroad. And so not only is the top part a map of the route that they were surveying, but the lower part is the elevations. And so you can see here where you started at Omaha. Here they said 966 feet. And you work your way out across the state. It says 20 miles to the inch. So as you come across here, this is the elevation. So it's 6 feet per mile. Doesn't sound too bad. 6.5 feet per mile. By the time you get halfway at Kearney, you're at 2,000 feet. You've picked up 1,000 feet. Now you're at 8 feet per mile. Then as you get across here toward the middle part, here's North Platte. See, it says 2759, where the North Platte River comes in and meets with the South Platte River. And that was a major point for, so you'll come up to the top here. There's Kearney. And here's North Platte. So the river's made its kind of southern sweep, and it's right here where the rivers come together. Back where I talked about Julesburg a ways back, that's here at this junction where the South Platte River comes in at Julesburg, and the railroad route, there's one called Lodgepole Creek. So it is another creek valley that they were following. Again, makes logical sense. Up to Pine Bluffs, into Cheyenne, and then over here into the mountains over by Laramie. So anyway, I'm going to go back to the depth map, or the height map. So in here, it's the South Platte River, and it's like it starts going. There's Julesburg, so now you're going to 15 feet per mile. There's Sidney, and it says Lodgepole Creek is what it's following above that. And now you're up to 20 feet per mile, 30 feet per mile, 35. So here's Pine Bluffs, you're going up, you go over the ridge and you go into Cheyenne. And then that stretch I was on as you're going, it's actually from Cheyenne to Sherman. Now you're like 80 feet per mile, which is like 1.5%, which for a railroad is a pretty significant grade to pull. I'll say especially in the steam engine days. But it's also why you see these huge trains coming out of the yard heading for the mountains with, I think the biggest one I saw had 7 locomotives. It had 4 in the middle, 3 in the, or it had 4 in the front, 3 in the middle, and 1 at the tail. And that train, I sat in a diner having my dinner, and I got served when the front locomotives started pulling out, and I was finished with dinner before that tail left. I was paying my bill when the tail end of it left. But anyway, historically speaking, so you go up here and you go to Beaufort and Sherman, and at 8,235 feet. So this is the area where that Ames Monument was. This Beaufort is where the Tree in the Rock was. And then there's Dale Creek right there. There's 79. Where I just was with the video. And then they work their way back down into Wyoming, into Laramie. And then you go across the whole state. There's Rawlins. See, all of these grades all the way across the state are above 6,000 feet. All the way across. all the way across until you get to Utah, and you head down into the Salt Lake Valley, and then they stopped surveying over here at the Humboldt Mountains in I believe that's into Nevada. And the Promontory Mountains and that in here is where they met up with this that famous point where they met up with the Central Pacific Railroad and did the Golden Spike. So to my earlier comment about the North Platte River, so here's the North Platte, and you can see it comes through here and flows out of the backside of the really high Rocky Mountains here. These are it flows out of northern Colorado and comes up in here, makes the loop around. If you were Oregon Trail, there's the Sweetwater River. But they didn't want to go that far, so let's get a closer look here. So when you come out of Cheyenne, and this is the railroad, old US 30, Interstate 80, they all kind of head out this way. I said Tree in the Rock, there's Sherman, that's the peak. And then today they actually took and, well, I think if you go look at the maps, go look up at, I think it was trains.com or somewhere I was looking, where there's an old Sherman and a new Sherman. So the old peak was up here and the new one is more down here, and they actually kind of ran down. I'm not sure. I think they actually kind of make a cut here and sweep around and connect in below. But you got to remember that in the 1800s, you didn't have GPS. You didn't have easy ways to do elevations. I'm sure they had tools, but you had to walk where you were going or ride a horse or whatever. And so figuring out how to precisely map some of these areas, I mean, it looks like they did quite a bit, because this is a pretty detailed map. But just kind of look at what they had to go through. And then today, we come up through Beaufort, and I80 comes across up here and works its way into Laramie. And it looks kind of more like this, where down here the North Platte River, or down here the Platte River goes a little bit further north and comes into Omaha, and I-80 goes down to Lincoln instead, cuts across here, and here's this stretch going up into Cheyenne, where most of the climb is. And back in the early days, that was only a 2-lane road, even when it was interstate. That's what that means, to Cheyenne and then on through. And today, the I-80 comes through. This is an old route from highway. This would be like the old US 30, and Interstate 80 takes more of a straight route. But I'll tell you, it was an interesting drive. It was a long drive, but I hope that's of interest to you and helps a little bit, because a lot of us, a lot of people don't travel long distances from home, and they know what's 100 miles from them. And so you kind of got to think about, where are you going, what are you doing, and what does it take to get there? The Colorado Rockies are a formidable thing to get through, and even to the south, to New Mexico and Arizona, you've got some pretty darn good mountain ranges. The Rockies go down to the south too, And so when you were trying to get across the country, say from Chicago or Detroit, and get all the way through, this was the most logical place to go, but still a challenge. So, hey, I hope that was interesting to you. That's all for now.